there's another question. This has to do with image and reality. There's a lot of discussion here about the original and the copy, image and reality, as though perhaps reality in itself is unproblematic.
Absolutely.
And
see, I think that sort of image-reality split is a dead-end kind of issue. My assumption is that the images with which we are confronted and express ourselves in contemporary culture are as related to our reality as the images used by, say, the Mayan Indians in talking about the processes of the moon, or that were used in various other customary cultures to speak about, people living in agrarian societies, creating an aesthetic which in certain ways was all about fecundity and the growth of plants. People living in a fishing culture, creating an aesthetic which is all the tendency, which is all about the sea and about the sea as the source of life. And I think the tendency of a lot of moderns, and in certain ways I think a very problematic tendency of people in the contemporary world, is to assume that those people created an imagery which was embedded within a way of life, but that our imagery sort of floats nowhere, and that sort of reality and substance have become removed from one another. I would suggest that that's not the case, and that rather what has happened is that reality has changed along with the image changing. And that, just as one would find within, say, the arts of certain customary cultures, a place in which image spoke articulately about what it meant to be a person, spoke articulately about what it meant when one talked about values, spoke articulately about what it meant when one talked about the relationship between people and their material environment, about issues of social relationships and power. I think that within the imagery of contemporary life, those same issues are there. That is to say, reality is not some sort of static given found in some sort of primordial nature. Reality itself, if what we're talking about is kind of lived experience, is something which, like images, have a history. And I think from a critical vantage point and from an analytical vantage point, what we really need to do is not just to go on and on, kind of bemoaning the sort of triumph of simulacrum and sort of, bemoaning, the idea that sort of image and reality have nothing to do with each other, but in fact really confronting the ways in which imagery are a map by which we can come to know our reality more closely. And perhaps if we develop certain kinds of interpretive approaches to the world of the image, come to understand our reality more critically. In other words, when I, for example, in my teaching, or even say in the lecture today, get people to look at images closely, I'm less interested, although a first step obviously is getting people to look at and start trying to read and make sense of the image world. I'm less interested in them just becoming masters of image analysis than in having them become people who, within the realm of the imagery, can come to see manifest some of the realities and problems of contemporary life. I mean, just the way in which, if we would go back to some sort of anthropological setting, and we would look at the cups and the bowls and the designs by which people live and say, through those kinds of things, a whole way of life is being mapped out. And if we can look at those artifacts, we can understand that way of life, both its visions and its possibilities, as well as its limits and its restrictions. My sense is that the study of the world of the image in contemporary culture can yield the same possibilities, the ability to really look at the world and look at reality and understand it more intelligently.
That's actually one of the things that I really wanted for you to talk about. I think you've done it very eloquently, this split between image and reality and that kind of stuff, which is an important one. Often gets lost.
Well, the whole last section of All-Consuming Images, which is on sort of the politics of style in contemporary culture, takes these sort of fundamental areas of life, power, value, the relation between people and the material environment, and examines those questions imagistically. And I would say that the kind of embedded agenda within that section of the book is really to get people to appreciate the synchronicity that exists between the realm of image and a way of life. I think one of the real limits of sort of postmodern analysis is that it is often sort of accepted the idea of the disembodied image at face value, and that we live in a world where there is no reality anymore, that we live in a world where there is only image. And let's put it this way, if we live in a world where image is taken over, it's because reality itself has become a place in which image has taken on a particularly powerful function in everyday life. And so, I'm very committed to doing what, to a large extent, people have abandoned, and that is really trying to resituate our understanding of images within the world as it is. And I basically assume that the world is comprehensible, and that the flutter of images, which often makes it, within, say, postmodern theory, seem sort of beyond analysis, almost, and that the analysis becomes that it's beyond analysis, is an example of sort of intellectual life really reneging on its responsibility to make the world more coherent, understandable.
Yeah, in many ways, it's when you talk about images, it's the same way that anthropologists talk about goods as markers and
absolutely,
the way people relate to each other.
Absolutely. I think it's not something I learned particularly through academia, but I was as a person, I grew up in a family which over a 3-generation period had moved from being immigrant people very sort of wedded to a material way of life to becoming, in my own case, sort of a child of the American barbecue that was taking place in the post-World War II era, kind of this new consumer culture in which image was everywhere. And I think because in certain ways in my own sort of autobiographical experience, family, grandparents, parents, at different generations, I almost sort of intuitively understood that the way of life that was being proselytized in my immediate environment was very particular and was very at odds with the way in which other people had seen things. I began to have, in certain ways, a very sort of relative view of immediate culture. In other words, to understand, yes, it was a way of seeing, but at the same time it was also a way of not seeing. And I think I was, on a very instinctual level, always sort of thinking about the silences and those sort of ideas and outlooks which were buried within the sort of framework of contemporary culture or hidden. And as a result, I think what sort of drew me in the direction that I went in terms of my own sort of intellectual and, forget intellectual, in my life, was to sort of be like a Martian anthropologist, somebody who had sort of landed in the middle of this world, and rather than just accepting sort of American consumer culture as quote-unquote reality, seeing it as a particular reality and as a way of seeing and a way of engaging in life, which had certain premises built into it, and which was not, in fact, the only way to live.